For the benefit of this audience, I would like to divulge I was in a bunker in Israel, in Tel Aviv, ducking bombs coming in from Hamas. Why? Why was I in Israel? Given this panel is about Israel, Islam, and the West, it's worth divulging that why was I in Israel. On October 10th, by we I mean I direct something called the N7 Initiative. It's funded by Jeffrey Talpin's foundation, and it sits at the Atlantic Council. We had convened the following participants to attend a summit in Tel Aviv: Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Turkey, Azerbaijan, Indonesia, and yes, the Palestinian Authority, Morocco, and others. We had hedge fund people from New York. We had sovereign wealth fund presence from some of the countries I've just mentioned. The attack from Hamas was what we, in Muslim communities around the world, call the Islamist organization that threatened not just Israel, but threatened these organizations, these representatives of these countries that were there, in order to continue building on the Abraham Accords and deepening and broadening the normalization of Israel in the Middle East and in the wider Muslim world. Now, I just put that out there because I know there are people in the audience and further beyond who will think, we don't recognize Israel, and therefore, what gives us the legitimacy to stand here? And I think it's fundamentally wrong, and I think it's also analytically flawed to put all Muslims, that's 1.8 billion of us, that's 60 plus nation states, some of whom border China, given the Chinese Western global tensions, just to say we're going to write all of you off under the banner of the Muslim Brotherhood. To do that is to give the Muslim Brotherhood victory over us. So I want to tell you 3 stories, if I may, and then turn just to a policy recommendation note. But the 3 stories are as follows. The first story is of a prophet, the second is of a president, and the third is of a philosopher. All 3 are personal, close to my heart for different reasons. The first is the prophet, and by the prophet I mean here the Arabian prophet. There were prophets from the line of Abraham, and we find this in the Bible that confirms the legacy of Ishaq or Isaac. And then there's the legacy of Ismail or Ishmael. And we who are Muslims are from that Abrahamic lineage. We are the children of Ishmael. Why is that story relevant? Because the Prophet Muhammad was the last of the Abrahamic prophets in the Muslim reading, and he founded what we now call Islam. Now, what does this Islam mean? Unless we define our terms in a Socratic mode, we're not then able to talk about Islamism, the political ideology inspired by Marxism. By Islam, we mean something very simple. If our Jewish cousins, if our Jewish forebears believe Israel, or from the word sira, is to wrestle with God, Islam comes from the word istislam or silm, which is to surrender to God. That's where the tension begins, where Judaism or the culture, the spirit of Israel is to wrestle, to ask questions, to combat. Ours is surrender. Istislam or umirna an uslima li rabbil alameen, that we were commanded in the language of the Quran to submit to the Lord of the worlds. Now, the Prophet Muhammad called us to the worship of the same one God of Abraham. And I'm not making this up. Yesterday we heard a lot about India. India has a pantheon of gods that are pagan. With Islam and Muslims, for all of our contemporary flaws, what you're getting is the first Judeo-Christian civilization. And the Prophet Muhammad drew from both Christianity and Judaism. We recognize the Hebrew prophets, but we also recognize Jesus as the Messiah. And that's inscribed in the Quran again and again. Now, just a few points about the prophet, and then allow me to turn to the president and why the president is relevant. On the prophet, he recognized Jerusalem as a home for Judaism and Jewish people. That is a historical fact. And I say that with the confidence that yes, there are incidents in Khaybar. Yes, the Prophet turned against 3 tribes that were seen to be treasonous, but maintained his alliance with other Jewish tribes. But Jerusalem, belonging to Jewish people, comes from the following fact, that the Prophet Muhammad prayed toward Jerusalem. That the Quran, as he recited, says, Ya qawmi dkhulul arda al-muqaddasata allati kataba Allahu lakum. O my people, i.e. Jewish people, Moses saying, enter the promised land that was prescribed for you. Now that's not Uganda, That's not Venezuela, that is Jerusalem and its surroundings, as Muslims know and understood from that time. And also because after 500 plus years of Roman exile, and this is from my friend Dory Gold, it was Muslims under the second Caliph Umar who invite Jewish people back. So not only does in the year 636, 637, the second Caliph Sayyidina Umar conquer Jerusalem, he brings Jewish people back and calls for the rebuilding of the temple, cleans the Temple Mount, because he recognizes through the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad that the Jewish people belong here, have a claim here. So that's the first point about Islam and the Prophet I want to leave with you. The second is that the Prophet's ummah was not a supremacist ummah. The word supremacist is rightly being used. His ummah included, when he went to Medina, he included Jews and he included Christians. And verses in the Quran, هَذِهِ أُمَّتَكُمْ أُمَّةً وَاحِدَةً وَأَنَا رَبُّكُمْ فَاعْبُدُونَ, this is your nation, one nation, and worship your Lord, the one Lord, i.e. the God of Abraham, the God of Moses, the God of Jesus, the God of Solomon. Now, so that's the second point to bear in mind, that the Prophet's ummah, by his definition, was inclusive. The third point to bear in mind, that his Sharia was not some system, this Hegelian system that then finds expression in Karl Marx's material dialectical approach to the world that creates nothing but everything systemic racism and we're all parts of a system. The Prophet's Sharia was not systemic. He was not focused on creating a system. When he passed away, it wasn't clear who would succeed him. He doesn't create a caliphate. He doesn't create a monarchy. And that's one of the reasons why you find throughout Muslim history various forms of government. And it's just worth bearing in mind that Abdullah bin Bayya, the Mufti of the United Arab Emirates, and others, going back to Imam Ghazali's teacher, Imam al-Juwayni, that's 1,000 years ago, repeatedly argue that the Sharia is about the following 5 things. It's about the preservation of life. It's about the freedom of worship. It's about knowing your family background, your nasab as the Arabs say. It's about private property, surprise, surprise, Karl Marx, Adam Smith. And it's about security in society. Any government, any society that produces and promotes and protects these 5 facets is already Sharia compliant. So I've got news for you. America is already Sharia compliant. America does not need Sharia. The entire West is Sharia compliant. Where we have issues and there's no Sharia compliance is China, because there Muslims and Jews and others cannot practice religious freedom. So that's the Prophet Muhammad's Sharia. We don't need a new Sharia state. We're already there because we're not living in the barbaric world of preventing people from practicing the religious freedoms. And the last point about the Prophet's way of being, and then I'll move on to the President, is that he was not a totalitarian. Again and again, he calls us towards compassion, mercy, kindness, pluralism. Which brings me to my second story, and that's the story of the President. And by President, I mean in the Middle East, much like in Singapore, in Asia, in 1973, 1971, the founding of the United Arab Emirates by a wise president called Sheikh Zayed. And Sheikh Zayed's son now, Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed, widely known as MBZ, inherited a world in his region that was not the prophetic world that I've just described. Inherited a neighboring Iran, which was advocating for a totalitarian form of Sharia. Now, this is where the Islamism of the Middle East, the modern Middle East, creeps in. So if we talked about Islam, the kind of faith that most Muslims around the world aspire to in my story about the Prophet, what we have with the president of the UAE, MBZ or Mohammed bin Zayed, what he is facing is a surge in Islamism. So what is Islamism? If the Prophet talked about Jewish people having a claim to Jerusalem, and if his second caliph reinstated Jewishness to Jerusalem, Iran was committed to destroying the state of Israel and removing Jewishness from Israel and the entire Middle East. We know that because Sayyid Qutb writes a book after he spends time in America. He goes back and writes a book called Ma'arakatuna ma'al Yahud, Our Battle with the Jews, not with Zionists, not with Israel, but with Jews. That book is translated by one Khamenei, who is now president of Iran. That modern vein of Jewish, not just hatred, but removal and destruction. I know someone will say, oh, well, what about Muslim anti-Semitism throughout history? To which I say, well, what about 1492? And what about the hundreds of other incidents all the way down to the Holocaust when Muslims gave succor and comfort to Jewish people? So the choice is ours. Which narrative do we want to lean on for what kind of world do we want to create. So that was the world that MBZ inherits and continues to fight. He also fights not just the Jew hatred, he also finds himself surrounded by the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood in his own country and in the region. He finds himself with the Arab Spring launched on him from Egypt, supported by President Obama and others. And he finds himself with a region that is increasingly abandoned by America. Now, why do I mention all of this, and why do I mention MBZ? Because since 9/11, perhaps the most important American foreign policy achievement was the Abraham Accords. And the Abraham Accords came about because MBZ said to his ambassador here, His Excellency Yusuf al-Utaiba, that go and find a way to normalize with Israel. And what we have from the Abraham Accords and the desire to bring Jewishness and Israel back to where it belongs, i.e. in the Middle East, is the creation of the Abrahamic family house, is the invitation of the Pope to attend Mass in Abu Dhabi, and I was present there when that happened. But it was also that his younger brother, Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed, visiting Israel, signing the Abraham Accords, changing the curriculum in multiple Muslim nations to remove Jew hatred. Now you can talk to me about the hatred, or we can talk about the new mood in the Middle East, led by the Abraham Accords, led by this president, Mohammed bin Zayed, and followed by Saudi Arabia and other nations in the region who now want to find a different way. Which takes me to the conference that I mentioned to you earlier, which was part of this initiative, driven from Washington, D.C. and multiple Arab capitals to normalize and expand Israeli relations in the Middle East and beyond. So that is fundamentally important. That I think is another way of looking at the world which is different from the Muslim Brotherhood and its totalitarianism and its fascism and its Marxism-inspired world. Which brings me to the story of the philosopher that I want to mention, and I'll end on this. The philosopher was my teacher. I was his last and final doctoral student. His name was Sir Roger Scruton. Many of you in the audience will be familiar with him. Roger was my teacher because in Roger I found that he understood this fundamental distinction between Islam, the faith of the Prophet, the faith of MBZ, the president of the UAE who prays, but doesn't drink but allows others to drink, who doesn't impose Sharia in a totalitarian way, who believes in the maqasid approach that I just highlighted, who has a pluralist approach to modern governance and is an ally of the West. I mention all of this because Roger Scruton understood that distinction. Roger Scruton educated me on the importance of Leo Strauss, but also the Maimonidean tradition that the Muslims helped unleash. Now, it was the protection that the Egyptians gave Maimonides, Musa bin Maymun as we call him in the Arabic tradition, that allowed him to write. And I can go on maybe during the Q&A to explain, yes, he was expelled from Morocco, but it wasn't that Montpellier in France gave him shelter. It was Cairo, it was Egypt, and today in the UAE we have the Abrahamic family house named after Musa bin Maymun, Maimonides. Now, Roger knew that unless we're able to make this analytical distinction between Islamism, the political ideology, inspired by fascism and Marxism, and Islam, the faith, then the very future of the West is at risk. Because now the old culture of we're going to do away with Muslims no longer works. You've got, 30 million Muslims in the West? The question is, how do we shape an Islam and a Muslim identity that's at home with the nation state and with conserving our faith traditions, our scriptures, and learn to live and love our fellow citizens, be they Hindus, Jews, Muslims, Christians, or others. Roger, and I'll end on this before I get to the policy point, Roger also wrote extensively about Islam and the West, wrote about the fact that St. Thomas Aquinas was heavily influenced by Muslim thinkers, wrote extensively about Ibn Rushd or Averroes, about Ibn Sina, Avicenna being the great medieval Muslim historian that influenced heavily both Aquinas and Maimonides and indeed Spinoza and others. So this is the philosophical tradition that we ought to lean on in order to maintain a Burkean future. The policy recommendation with which I want to finish is this. The previous speaker was absolutely right in his analysis of the threat posed by CARE and other Hamas front organizations. Legislation already exists on the books here in America from 1871 in relation to the Klan to ban our version of the Klan. The Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas, are the Muslim version of the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan. They are our Nazis. And your legislation exists to ban that. If you don't ban the Muslim Brotherhood, as they've been banned in Mecca, Medina, the UAE, and elsewhere, then you don't have a right to turn around and say to Muslims, why don't you address the extremism problem? Because the extremism problem is festering here, as well as in my country, in the UK. So if there's a policy prescription that you ought to think about in your think tanks and in your spaces, it is how do you ban a terrorist, supremacist organization that seeks to derail the West and undermine its own electoral processes. Thank you very much for listening.